one group of attackers were branded as evil, branded as terrorists, and we used that word very strongly in the media at the time. And the other group of attackers or counter-attackers were branded as heroes and soldiers. And yet there was an attack on both sides. So what's happened is, over the years of, say, the average 30-year-old person's life, he's grown up with these media inculcated images of heroism. Heroes are strong, heroes are decisive, heroes are powerful. And suddenly we have this word hero being latched onto acts of war. So soldiers are almost invariably called heroes in the national press or the commercial media. And in using these words, they've pulled in a value set that isn't necessarily the value set attached to the actions that are actually taking place. Now you can go broader than this, than the assimilation of one value set into another, by looking at maybe how Hollywood and literature also play their part in building up values behind acts of war. Personally, I never really particularly fantasized about being a soldier, but I understand that many young men do. They see a glamour in perhaps the clarity of action that comes with a soldier, or the purpose of soldiering, the pride, the connection with their homeland. And most movies play their part when they deal with war. Most movies play their part in encouraging a thinking along the lines of the good guys, if they fight the bad guys, firstly the good guys will win, and secondly that the good guys have, if you like, God on their side, or justice on their side, or the right on their side. And an interesting one to look at is Star Wars, because Star Wars has a very strong sense of good and evil, and yet in and amongst the good and evil, if you count the sort of stormtroopers in their white suits as people, which to some extent they must be, albeit that they're clones, the value set in Star Wars that it is okay to kill these white suited people for the greater good. And so the people who do a lot of killing on behalf of the so-called good guys in Star Wars are justified in doing that killing. Now these value sets drop in the call for war in the West. And they've dropped in very heavily, I think, in the last 7-8 years we've seen since 9/11. So those are two things to think about. The third thing to think about is really the idea of choice. I've talked to a fair amount of people in the military, and it's become a matter of curiosity for me to understand why people with good hearts and good feelings and good minds, apparently, would jump into an act of what I would see of an act of disorder. Albeit that disorder is created outside our society, it's created in Iraq or Afghanistan, but it's essentially an act of civil disorder. They're disordering another society because they're told to do it. A lot of people in the military or former military people say it's just a job. So there's something in the sense of job, a job in the military, a role in the military, that allows them not to have to make a choice about consequence. They suddenly sit down and they say, well, I would think about the consequences of what I'm doing, but not in this case because this is my job. And you just do it. If it wasn't my job, these acts that I'm doing, firing a mortar over a wall or something like that, into who knows where, may have some sense of consequence for me, but because it's my job, because I'm following orders, I don't look into consequences. Now there are strong benefits to a coordinated organizational system. You know, we don't want necessarily a bus driver suddenly deciding that he doesn't feel like taking the normal route when we're on our way to work, and he'll take a different route, and therefore we don't get to go where we need to go. But I think there are also situations where we need to exercise free will and choice, and I think the military is certainly one where the lack of exercise of free will and choice puts the power of decision making for acts which have a serious consequence. Like I said, this disordering consequence. And I use disordering as a euphemism for all these consequences of war, and I hope you don't find it too belittling of what I see as quite serious consequences. Very serious consequences. But it puts the responsibility and the thinking behind these massive consequences in the hands of very few people. So, who knows, 1, 10, depending on what you believe, 100, 1,000. If you really believe it's the democratic actions of the public. But either way, it takes the responsibility out of the hands of the agents and puts it in the hands of the decision makers. Now, I think the decision makers have failed to consider consequences intelligently, and they have their own debate to have with themselves and with us, I think, about their choices. But I do see this also as a failure in the hands and minds of the agents to exercise due diligence in the quality of the orders they're being given. Now, I'm not necessarily advocating some kind of revolution or disobedience along the lines of the refusal of a soldier to take any orders, but I think that a soldier has to look at his motivation behind being a soldier and say, do these orders match up with my motivation to the best of my knowledge? And there was no shortage of knowledge, I think, on the side that said this military action had not been thought through and had not been subject to the inquiry or judicial process that I think I outlined at the beginning of this little conversation. And this comes down to this idea of choice. Do we have choices as to say no and say yes? And it depends on your faith and your belief, because there are faiths which, especially some of the Christian denominations, where they had quite a strong sense of that they could choose a choice even if it meant death. And then there are other choices more in the sort of humanist traditions, I guess, where the choices might have been that you would choose civil disobedience or choose to not engage in acts of violence because of your conscience or conscientious objection and so on and so forth. And I see a lot when I talk to military people a sense that they don't really have a choice anyway. And what else would they do? And I think that's something that we need to address if we're going to look at war and the motivations behind war. So I would suggest an inquiry into that. So overall, I think there's a lot of ways to look at what's happened since 9/11 in terms of the structure of our society and the way we process information about war and its consequences and so on and so forth. And I've tried not to take a hardline view. I've tried to take a view that's an inquiring view, which ultimately may lead to better results, although personally my views are probably more hardline than they come across. But I've tried to sort of integrate my sense of curiosity as to why and how we resolve what I see as a problem of militarism, as opposed to just slamming it because I've got a particular view. So if anyone else has got any views, please do let me know. My email is alastairdobbie@gmail.com, alastairdobbie@gmail.com. Thank you very much for listening. It's been fun talking for almost 20 minutes.